I remember what got me interested in fishing, and it was fishing for brim, just dangling dough balls off the side of a dock in a lake. And I hooked a bluegill or a brim and was lifting it out of the water, and a bass left the water and ate this panfish on the way up. And I can see it all, hear it all, I remember it all. And that incident was the springboard for me as far as fishing was concerned.
Welcome to the Wild South Podcast. I'm Dave DiBenedetto, Editor-in-Chief of Garden & Gun magazine.
And I'm Eddie Nickens, contributing editor for Garden & Gun.
Together, we're talking with the most interesting outdoorsmen and outdoors women in the South and far beyond.
Quail hunters and duck hunters, trout anglers and redfish fanatics, musicians, scientists, writers, wild game cooks, and frankly, a few wildcats we dig up along the way.
We're talking about legends and legends in the making.
All with unforgettable stories of life way beyond the sidewalk.
And today, we are talking with Flip Pallot. So Eddie, what a way to kick off the Wild South Podcast.
You know, I remember when we were talking about this show and what the Wild South could be, sort of the ethos that we were after, and both of us knew instinctively at the same time, we got to get Flip Pallot. He's been like the North Star to so many of us who love the outdoors in the South and around the world.
You know, and so many of us first got to know Flip because of Walker's Cay Chronicles, right? The outdoor show that took outdoor shows to the next level. Up to that point, there were guys kissing largemouth and hooting and hollering, and there was nothing soulful, there was nothing authentic, there was nothing that really spoke to you. Flip could have ended it there, and he'd still be a legend. But, I mean, the man is deep.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, he went from television show to a lauded career as a guide there in Florida. He had a chance meeting with a island owner in the Caribbean that kicked off the Walker's Cay Chronicles. After that, he co-founded Hell's Bay. This is the man who brought the flat skiff, the poling skiff, to the American consciousness. I mean, you can't swing a fly rod without busting into somebody's flat skiff.
I mean, think about that alone. The ubiquitous flats boat. What it did for flats fishing in Florida. What it did for flats fishing up the East Coast. I mean, we're using flats boats in the marsh grass for redfish, for striped bass in the Northeast. I mean, changed an entire fishery.
Yeah, and I think he changed more than just a fishery. This is the man who taught the Cedars brothers, who founded Yeti Cooler, taught those guys how to fly fish. The very first ad that featured a Yeti cooler had Flip in it. He's just come to embody so much of what we love about the outdoors, and he's a very inspirational figure.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, he's humble, so humble, but, you know, a hero of mine. And in my position, I've been lucky enough to meet a number of my heroes. And you don't always come out of the other side thinking the same way that you did before going into it. When I met Flip, I left with even higher regard. You know, I'm like, wow, that is the real deal.
How did you guys meet? I met him because you gave me a magazine assignment for Garden & Gun. What was your first meeting with Flip?
So we had a Garden & Gun event at Deepwater Cay, the now closed Bonefish Lodge down in the Bahamas, and Flip was the main attraction. People paid to come fish with Flip and hang out with the editors of Garden & Gun. So the first day, I'm heading down to the dock, and I had grabbed my flats boots, which I had gotten in a previous gig. I think it was at Field & Stream, and the manufacturer was claiming that, you know, coral wouldn't cut your feet. They were indestructible. And I get down to the boat, and the first thing Flip does, he looks at me and he says, "What are you planning on doing, hiking the Appalachian Trail?"
That was his opening salvo, huh?
Yeah, from there we got along famously. It was an amazing day. I mean, I would say it's just like if somebody was shooting baskets with Michael Jordan. I mean, to watch Flip cast, to hear Flip talk about the environment that we were floating on and passing by, the pine trees, the soft coral, all of it. It was an unforgettable day.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think the thread that ties his life and impact together is this notion of connecting an individual's experience to the natural environment. He's well known for carving out of guava a fork that he puts on the end of his pole that he pulls his flat skiff with. And I asked him one time, why that and not, the skiff poles come with a plastic foot. And he sort of recoiled. He's like, he couldn't touch his beloved Florida with a piece of plastic. That wouldn't be right.
Yeah.
I think it's those kinds of stories, those kinds of insights that make him a beloved figure far beyond fly fishing, far beyond the hunting and fishing world. He's the North Star of what we're doing here at the Wild South.
Absolutely. So let's get on with it and let's talk with Flip. Flip, it is so good to see you, my friend.
It's good to see all y'all.
Look at that good-looking man. How you doing, Flip?
Well, could not be better, really. I'm doing good.
Flip, I can't tell you how excited we are to have you on the show. I want to get right into it. And I know you and your wife, Diane, you guys live in Mims, Florida, which is on the Space Coast and not far from the fabled St. Johns River. And I've heard that you guys have some pretty interesting neighbors. Tell me about these turkeys.
Well, when we decided to move up here from Homestead after Hurricane Andrew in '93, we found this piece of property for sale that was in the woods, and there were no other houses at the time anywhere around. I walked off in the woods just to look at the property, and I scared 9 hogs and a flock of turkeys. And I came back to the truck and I said, Diane, we have to buy this property immediately. And from the very first that we moved here, those turkeys were always here, and they've just gotten more numerous, and they're completely broke. I mean, when I walk out in the morning, there could be a dozen gobblers waiting for me to feed them. They're almost like chickens at this point. But the good part of it is that if I get a coffee and go out in the dark in the morning and sit there until it starts to break daylight, I hear them in the trees. I hear every single sound that they make. And so it's almost like a postgraduate course in turkeys. More than anything else, I think I've learned what not to say to turkeys when I'm turkey hunting.
That brings to mind, you do everything you can outdoors, right? And the fact that you grab your coffee cup every morning and walk outside. You told me one time, Flip, if you have the choice to do it outside or inside, do it outside. And I've really incorporated that. If I can eat outside, if I can take my coffee outside, anything, just get outside as much as you can.
I think that it's important in some way that I can't really codify, that we see as many sunrises and sunsets as we can. I think it's cathartic in some way, even necessary in some way that we may not be able to put our fingers on, but I think it matters.
It does matter. I totally agree. So let's go back in time here and get into a little bit of your formative years. Eddie, you were telling me there's a story about Flip and hawks that really reveals a lot about this guy. Let's hear it.
Yeah. Flip, I mean, there's a lot we can talk about, and there's so many stories you can tell, but this is one of my favorite ones that you've shared with me, and that is about the young Flip Pallot catching hawks at Tahiti Beach. I think that story explains so much about who Flip Pallot is and where he comes from, how you got to be, the dude who uses a wood burning kit to burn new tread in the bottom of your worn out Crocs. It's sort of all, it all leads back to Tahiti Beach. Tell us that story.
Well, I guess to understand the story, you'd have to understand that at that time in my life, which was like 12, 13 years old, Miami was a pretty rural place. It didn't resemble in any way what it is today. Now it's a megalopolis almost. I mean, well, it is, with millions of people, millions. And when I was there, the whole thing, Greater Miami, was 80,000 people.
Oh, wow.
Kids rode bicycles, and they rode great distances without thinking anything about it. I mean, a 30, 40-mile bicycle trip, it was nothing for kids then. So anyway, we did everything on our bicycles, and we had learned of this man, Ross Allen, who had a tourist attraction in Florida called Ross Allen's Birds of Prey. And he had these newsletters, and he wrote about catching two different kinds of hawks. One was kestrels, and one was red-shouldered hawks. Those were the two most common hawks in South Florida when I was a kid. And catching kestrels involved, well, we would take the little square crate that they used to deliver milk in to your doorstep every day, and we would turn it upside down, put a white mouse or a guinea pig underneath it, and then tie, 200 loop knots in short pieces of monofilament attached to the top of the cage. And we would put this little milk crate with the guinea pig under a power line, and the kestrels would fly down to get the guinea pig, and they would land on top of the milk crate and entangle their feet, their talons, in those loop knots, and they'd be just stuck there. So we could go over to the crate and just collect them, basically. It was much more intricate to catch red-shouldered hawks. Do you know what an AWOL bag is?
No.
Every airline used to make a little bag, probably 18 by 20 inches or so, and had a zipper top and two handles, and they would give them to passengers, and the passengers would just put stuff that they intended to carry on the plane in these little AWOL bags. And we would ride our bicycles to Coral Gables, and then we would get on a bus, which would take us downtown Miami, where there was a big park, and there were pigeons in this park, millions of pigeons. And we would start feeding the pigeons until we got a crowd of them around us, and then we would grab a pigeon and put him in that AWOL bag, and we would get 4, 5, or 6 of them and get on the bus, go back to the bus station in Coral Gables, get our bicycles, which we simply leaned up against the building. And then we would ride over to this beach, which was about 15 miles from the bus station, and we would dig holes in the sand, and we would cover one another up, whoever's chance it was to be in the hole, and cover the person up with sand. We would take a bushel basket, and in between the slats, there's just a little bit of space so that air can get in and move around. And we would put a bushel basket over top of our head. We would tie a little string to the foot of a pigeon and run the string out through one of those little holes. And we would have a welder's gauntlet on our right hand and hold on to the string with our left hand. And the other person would hide, and the pigeon would just walk around outside the bushel on the sand, and a red-shouldered hawk would dive down and grab him and start eating him right there. And while he was doing that, you'd pull on the string and then put the string between your teeth, then grab the string again and pull it again, and then put it between your teeth until you pulled the hawk who was eating the pigeon right up against the bushel basket. And then you'd hold the string in your teeth, put your left hand under the top of the bushel, and with the welder's gauntlet, you would suddenly push the bushel up and grab the hawk with the gauntlet, and he'd try to bite you. But you had on this gauntlet, and he couldn't bite through that, and you had a hawk.
Then what?
Well, then we were free to just ride straight home from there. And then we would sell those hawks to either Ross Allen, or we would sell them to a guy named Bill Host, who had another tourist attraction. We would get $30 for a kestrel, $45 for a red-shouldered hawk.
You were rich.
I had more money than my father. It was hysterical. Yeah.
So how'd the hawk get home?
In the AWOL bag.
Oh, in the AWOL bag.
Yeah. No, you didn't want to be seen. We had it worked out. It was very, very seamless the way that we did it.
What strikes me about that story is, a couple of themes. Just freedom, Flip, the initiative that you had to have to even think about riding to a park and catching a pigeon, and riding to a park and catching a hawk and riding and selling. Sort of the entrepreneurial spirit as well, but just your ability to tinker That's kind of one theme of your life. You've made a lot of cool stuff that enabled you to do a lot of cool things.
When you say things like that, I think you're thinking in terms of today. There simply is no comparison. A child of 12 or 13 years old today is not anything like what a child was at that age then. I mean, today, a child that age is limited by his surroundings and by the situation in the world. It's not safe for kids to do what I did then. I was 12 years old. I had a knife in my pocket every time I put pants on. We actually played as a very, very serious activity, a game that we called tree tag, where we would climb up in these giant trees and chase one another around the trees like monkeys. And we didn't think about the consequences of doing that. And somehow our parents didn't either. And somehow we lived through all that.
All right. You're about 12 in the story with the Hawks. So let's fast forward a little bit. I really want to talk about the tackle box. The tackle box was the shop that you went to as a kid, and it was where you met your best friends. We're talking about Chico Fernandez, Norman Duncan, and Little John Emery. And I believe it was Chico who called you guys the Four Musketeers. You were basically inseparable, and you would go on to really define what would become saltwater fly fishing. But for now, I just want to hear a little more about the tackle box itself.
Well, I'll just start by introducing the concept of a local tackle shop, we called them. Every little community had one or more. And at every one of these shops, there was a core group of people, all ages, that just hung out. And every one of these shops had a guy or a girl, very often it was a girl, that was a rod builder. And they would build custom rods for customers, or they would build shop rods that would just go on the wall for sale. And all of those rods reflected the light tackle. I mean, there really was a light tackle community then. Mm-hmm. And we had things like 2-pound test monofilament that actually tested 2-pound test. Mm-hmm. Big line was 8-pound test.
Wow.
That was like big stuff. And when I say big stuff, we all lived under the umbrella and the rules and the guidelines of a local tournament, which was called the Metropolitan Miami Fishing Tournament. And it had tackle divisions. It had a plug casting division, spin casting, fly casting, and then it had a general division where you could use anything. Every week, the local newspapers, the Miami Herald and the Miami News, had fishing columns, and the columnists would post the leaders in the different divisions of the Met tournament. It was a big deal. I mean, it was the central focus of our life.
So this culture of light tackle back then, Flip, that was really rooted in those tackle shops, right?
It was, and the Met tournament.
And the Met tournament.
Yeah.
And the young kids were in there as well. That's where you met some of the friends that you had for the rest of your life.
I met Chico in one of those local tackle shops in 1958. He had just come from Cuba. And John and I were in first grade together.
All right. Yeah.
So John was my friend always, maybe my first friend. And Norman, met Norman in the tackles box too.
Right. I mean, you might not want to say this, but you guys were pushing what it was to be a saltwater fly fisherman. And, Chico talks about how you sanded down 200-pound monofilament to make cheaper versions of a fly line. Y'all were continuing to invent and improve, right?
Well, our lives were outside. But I mean, I remember what got me interested in fishing, and it was fishing for brim with dough balls on a number 12 hook and a piece of Dacron line, just dangling dough balls off the side of a dock in a lake. and I hooked a bluegill or a brim and was lifting it out of the water, and a bass left the water and ate this panfish on the way up. And I can see it all, hear it all, I remember it all. And that incident was the springboard for me as far as fishing was concerned. And we lived in a time where none of the things that we needed existed. I mean, here's how crazy it was. Spinning was in its infancy, and it wasn't as efficient or effective a fish fighting tool as a plug rod was. Plug reels had no drags. I mean, it went as fast forward as it did backward. And so when you hooked a fish, the only way that you could ever catch him was to apply drag to the spool directly with your thumb. And there was a Cuban woman in one of the tackle shops that knitted these little doilies or condom-like things out of kite string that you slipped over your thumb, and it would allow you to apply pressure without burning your thumb off on the monofilament or the Dacron, whichever it was. When monofilament got really popular, the plug reels of the day, and the best one of all, was a reel called a Pfluger Supreme. The tolerances between the spool rim and the frame of the reel was inconsistent. In other words, you could buy one out of a box and it would be a really good tolerance between those two features of the reel. But some of the reels that you bought right out of the box, the tolerance was bad. And if you got any kind of an overrun, the monofilament would leap behind the spool and you would lose everything. We would actually go to a shop and make them take 15 or 20 boxes of Pfluger Supremes off the shelf, and we would go through each reel and check the tolerances of the spool, and they would see us coming and they would go, oh no, here they knew the four of us, and they knew that it was going to be, oh no, we're going to have to pull everything off the shelf and let these idiots go through. So everything that we needed or wanted to make the catches that we wanted to make, we had to adapt or invent or modify in some way. The rods that we needed didn't exist. We had to build them. We had to get the components and build them. And Norman Duncan had in his garage a very, very, very sophisticated rod wrapping machine, and he had a wood lathe. So we could turn the corks and shape the corks on a wood lathe. All of us took wood shop in high school so that we could use lathes. And we would build our own rods. We would coat the wraps with spar varnish. And while it was still wet, we would go fishing. We didn't care. But then the resource was so amazing, indescribable. I can't tell you what the resource was. I mean, how many fish, how many species of fish, and how accessible they were. The entire west shore of Biscayne Bay, which is huge, was accessible.
Wow.
Even if there was a house there, you didn't even have to ask if you could go into the yard and fish on the seawall or fish around the dock. And in those years, Florida had a law that if you operated farm equipment, you could get your regular driving license at 14. My family in North Florida, they farmed shade tobacco. And so in the summers, I would go up there and work and operate farm equipment. And I got my regular driving license when I was 14. And there was an old guy in the neighborhood that died. He had an old GMC pickup, and it was in his estate. And I borrowed a couple of $100 from my dad and bought that truck and paid him back in about 2 weeks from netting mullet at night, finger mullet, and selling those mullet to the bait shops. I mean, we were deadly dangerous once we had wheels. I mean, our range, we could drive to Key West and drive to the Everglades and fish the canals in the Everglades that were unfished. I mean, We would drive down the beach at Marco Island and Naples. We would drive along the sand. We'd put a guy with a fly rod in the bed of the truck and just drive right down the edge of the water. And you could see the snook laying in the surf. And when the guy in the truck spotted a fish, he would just tap on the hood. You'd stop, and he would cast right out of the bed of the truck to the fish in the surf. It was an amazing, wonderful time to grow up in America. I mean, there was just nothing going on except hunting and fishing and making up excuses for why your report card was so bad.
Duck Camp knows that life is not a highway. It's more like a gravel road where the asphalt ends and a chalky white cloud rises up behind to let you know good things lie ahead. Duck Camp's best-in-class fishing and hunting apparel has been tested out there, from Alaska's backcountry to the duck blinds of Louisiana, from buttery soft bamboo sun hoodies, one of my favorites, to brush pants to iconic Game Series hats. You can gear up for your next gravel road moment at duckcamp.com. When did the first boat come into your life?
Well, our first boats were air mattresses, and we all used our air mattresses to get around a lot of Biscayne Bay and the upper Keys.
Right.
It is amazing what you can do with a decent air mattress and light tackle. I mean, we went so far out into the bay to fish on air mattresses in such foul, crappy weather that I'm even alive is just amazing.
You just kneel on the air mattress and paddle?
No, you lay on it and paddle. Lay on your stomach and paddle. And you can go very fast and super far.
Yeah.
We had these little tackle boxes that we would tie onto the either end, the front end or the back end of the air mattress. And when you were paddling, you had the rod either underneath you or over top of your back, laying along lengthwise. And we had fish on stringers. And sometimes sharks would come and grab the fish on the stringers. I mean, we were on an air mattress. I mean, sometimes you could have 10 or 15 pompano on a string hanging off your air mattress and sharks all around trying to eat them. Before any of us had boats, we started renting boats from Speck's boat rental on Summerlin Key, and there was an old man named Speck, and he had big spectacles. And these were little 15-foot open skiffs, and you couldn't take the boat more than, I don't know, a mile away or something like that. We used to take those boats out into the ocean, I mean, to the Gulf Stream, and fish for amberjack and tuna, and we'd go so far into the backcountry, we'd have to hide gas on some of the islands and leave it there so that we could make those long trips. And when John decided to get a boat, he bought one of those rental boats from Speck and put a front casting platform on it and a rear deck and gunnels. And that was the first boat that was actually owned in our group.
So I want to talk a little bit about Walker's Cay. I mean, that's how the world we live in knows you, right? And what was brilliant about that show was we all felt like we knew you.
I think that the Walker's show was one of the early, very, very early saltwater fishing shows.
Right.
There wasn't much around in that genre. There were bass shows.
Right.
And so there was the opportunity to expose people for the first time to all of that. There was secondarily no competition for sponsors. And because there was no competition for sponsors, when we got sponsors, we were able to maintain creative control.
Right.
Today, there's so much competition for sponsors that the sponsors are in control of the content. And that reflects heavily on the production values of a television experience from a viewer standpoint. It's very, very infomercialistic today.
Right.
So we were able to concentrate on the two things, I think, that set Walker's apart from everything that followed. And those two things were, number one, production values. We shot it on film, and film had this enormously warm feeling to it. The other thing was we recorded sound separately, so the sound was 10 times better than everything else that was out there. And then I think the other thing that separated us was, every single episode focused on relationships.
Right.
And we featured not so much the fishing or the catching, but we always tried so hard to feature the relationship of the two people that were on camera. And we did that because we knew that everyone in our audience had a fishing buddy, a partner, someone that they went into the outdoors with during the happiest moments of their life. The most memorable moments of their whole life were spent with this other person. And we recognized the alchemy that can happen in a boat between two people. And it's an elusive thing to capture unless you're focused on it and then made the decision to capture it. And I think we realized the power of words as well.
Who wrote the voiceover montage? That opening scene.
The opening scene was written by a brilliant writer by the name of Pat Smith. After Pat, we had someone else doing it. When that second person left, then I did it.
Right.
I think what we understood from the very beginning is that things can be said in voiceover that cannot be said in dialogue. Mm-hmm. And things can be said in a certain way in voiceover that they can never be said in dialogue. And that peering into the camera and trying to utter sensible sentences for people who are not trained to do that always comes off just like exactly that. Do you remember Jerry McGinnis?
Yeah.
And Jose?
Yeah.
Those were two men who could look into the camera and make you feel as though they were talking to you. Those guys would look into the camera and they'd go, come here, come over here really close. I want to show you this, how I hook this minnow. The next thing you know, you're leaning into the television set, but that's a rare quality. I can't do that. Mm-hmm. And so voiceover became the tool that let me achieve what those guys did naturally.
And that show, it just took off, Flip. It just exploded.
There wasn't anything else.
I think you're not giving yourself enough credit. I know you had a vision for that show, and y'all worked hard to bring that vision to life. Was it ever articulated early on that this is what we're going to do and this is what we're not going to do? We're going to break the mold?
I hope no one takes this the wrong way. We had a model of what not to do, and it was the most popular show on television at that time, outdoor show, and it was called the ABC American Sportsman. And the format every week was some movie star or personality from sports who had no idea what they were doing when you put them on a drift boat and went down the Columbia River to catch steelhead or whatever. The celebrity was out of his element. And I guess some people found that engaging. It always was aggravating to me. And so there was never the relationship that I wanted to focus on. And that was this fishing buddy, hunting buddy, soulmate sort of relationship that I know that every viewer has. And so they never got to see, in the ABC American Sportsman, they never got to see themselves. And so I think that between the production values and the relationships and the fact that there was no infomercialistic aspect to the show whatsoever, and yet people would get close and try to figure out I'd get emails and letters, people begging to know what reel we were using, what line we were using, what fly we were using. They were interested technically, but I think they were drawn by the other two things, the production values and the relationships.
Yeah. There was an emotional connection.
Oh, yeah.
And there was an emotional connection to you, Flip, to you personally and particularly. You told me one time about the first time you were asked for your autograph. Do you remember this?
Let me see. I made it up, so I got to think back. I had at that point done a couple of episodes of a show called The Saltwater Sportsman, which I was hosting before Walker's Cake came along. And I had been on some of the old American sportsman shows, some of the outdoor life shows. But anyway, there was a general store that sold food and sundries, and we were going to go in there and buy some, I remember, rice crackers. And so Diane went down one aisle, and I went down another aisle, and I see this young woman, she like running down the aisle toward me, and she stops in front of me, and she goes, "Don't even try to deny it." She goes, "You're Flip Pallot. I know you are." And I was speechless. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know who she was. And she goes, "My husband is going to faint when he finds out that I met you. He's your biggest fan. He loves to watch you on television." And she goes, "Can I have your autograph?" Well, nobody in my whole life had ever asked me for an autograph. I said, "I don't have anything to write on." And she reaches up onto the shelf and grabs this box of Fruit Loops. And she says, "Just sign it on this box." She said, "And write a note to my husband. His name is Fred." She said, "Just write something personal to him." And I could not think of anything. And in the end, I'm embarrassed to say, I just wrote, "Dear Fred, have a nice life, Flip."
The most valuable box of Fruit Loops in the world.
All right. For the record, I love Fruit Loops. Let's talk about fly casting for a few minutes here. Something I wish that I was better at. I've seen Flip cast, and my takeaway from that was beyond wow, was that it just looked so effortless. Eddie, give us some idea of what sets Flip apart.
One of the things that I think people are struck by with Flip is his physical aspect of his fly casting. You cast differently than a lot of people flip. It's a beautiful way of casting. There's a couple of stories that I think might be interesting. And one is about, I think you're in Dallas. Is that right? When you were walking by the Abercrombie and Fitch store and you saw a sign about a fly casting demonstration. Tell us about that. Where were you in your career?
I was at that point in the retail store business. I had a retail store that was a hunting and fishing and outdoor art and very fine firearms store in a very high-end regional shopping mall in South Miami, Florida. And it fell to me to make trips every year to a menswear show in Dallas. And I was walking around the neighborhood of the convention center, and I noticed that they were having the grand opening of an Abercrombie and Fitch store downtown in Dallas. I had to go in and see the store. And on my way in, they had one of those A-frame signs by the door, and it said, "At 3:00 this afternoon on the roof, a fly casting demonstration by Charles Ritz." And I recognized the name Charles Ritz. I knew who he was. He was a great European traveling angler who did a lot of videos at the time and had written books. And so I went up on the roof. Nobody was there except this little man in a waistcoat and pointy-toed shoes, and he was standing there with a fiberglass rod. I did not think that was Charles Ritz. I mean, in my mind, he was quite a lot larger. I walked over, and I said, "Are you waiting for Mr. Ritz?" And he goes, No. I go, with this heavy, heavy, guttural German accent, let me know that he was Charles Ritz. So we chatted a little bit and nobody showed up. And I finally said to him, "It looks as though nobody is going to be here." And I said, "But I would love to hear what you have to say." And he came up with a method of casting which he called high speed, high line. And when I saw what he was doing, it was a revelation for me. The same sort of a revelation as when I first saw Lefty cast, and I realized what was actually possible with a fly rod.
Flip, is fly casting an art?
No, I don't think it's an art at all. I think fly fishing is a tool that challenges us to catch fish in a more contemplative, difficult, challenging way. If you're willing to learn how to cast 50 or 60 feet, you can be a very, very adequate fly fisherman.
We mentioned Lefty. Let's talk about Lefty for a minute. Flip, Lefty's the most famous fly fisherman. I mean, a character, an amazing character that so many of us are familiar with. You probably knew him best. Certainly as a fisherman, you knew him best. How would you explain Lefty to someone who'd never heard of him?
Wow, that's a difficult question. It's difficult because I really don't know anyone that I could compare to Lefty. But, if I had to sum him up, I would say things like he was gentle, he was very, very self-effacing, he was truly interested in you, no matter who the hell you were. If he met you for the first time at a show in New Jersey and he was having a bad day, he still made you feel as though you were very, very important to him. He came up a little bit ahead of me. He was a little older than I, but he came up at that same time when the things that he wanted and needed didn't exist. And so he had that same opportunity to contribute by invention, and he invented the system of fly casting that has brought more people into the sport than ever would have been here otherwise. If people had tried to come into the sport and been taught to cast in the conventional method, they would have bought a spinning rod. But Lefty came up with this elbow on the shelf, long stroke method, which people could evidently easily understand. And he could get them making that 50-foot cast pretty quickly and effortlessly, at least effortlessly enough so that they were engaged, not turned off.
All right, so let's just say somehow the good Lord's plan for you and you got one more day of fishing in you. Your boat, who's the one guest you'd invite?
It would be Lefty.
Yeah.
It would be Lefty. I'm going to tell you a very quick story. The first day that I ever fished with Lefty, I was a nervous wreck. This would have been, like 65, 66. I took Lefty back in the Everglades. It was a big bite that went way back up into the mainland, and it was called snake bite. And we were red fishing, and I was poling Lefty along, and he was up on the front deck with a fly rod. And I look up in the bite, and I see a herd of flamingos on the flat. And they're all in a line, walking together, scaring up shrimp on the flats. I could see their long necks and heads going down into the water, catching these shrimp. And I could see the splashing of the shrimp out ahead of the flamingos as they walked along in this big phalanx. And I said something to Lefty. I said, Lefty, there's a whole herd of flamingos coming toward us, and there's redfish all in among them. And the redfish were following the flamingos to get the shrimp. And Lefty put his fly rod down in the bottom of the boat and pulled out a camera and a 400 millimeter telephoto lens. And Lefty wanted the photograph of the redfish in among the legs of the flamingos more than he wanted to go up to the flamingos and cast a fly in there and catch a redfish. And, Lefty had just come to Florida. He hadn't caught many, if any, redfish on fly. And in spite of that, what was most important to him was this photograph. He was shooting black and white film. And it was a life lesson to me because he couldn't do both. It was the first of 1,000 days like that spent fishing with Lefty, where almost every day there was either a casting lesson, a life lesson. So without thinking of it very hard, it would be Lefty, and then the next person would be Diane, because more than anybody I've ever fished with, she appreciates it. And just seeing her appreciate it that much is what makes the day for me.
That's pretty special.
Flip, you're famous for giving nicknames to people in your life. I'm Smoke, right? Which you dubbed me one day when you didn't think I could sneak up on this bunch of Florida hogs that showed up and we were turkey hunting. And I replied that I moved like smoke through the woods. You remember that?
I do.
Yeah, there's your buddy Graham Hagemeyer, Bubbles, your longtime friend Bill Duck Bishop. But so far, nothing for poor old plain as mud David DiBenedetto.
Oh my goodness.
What you got for him, Flip? Anything come to mind for a handle?
Well, let's see. I'm a big fan of David's writing for a long, long time. So my knee-jerk reaction is going to be David, the word man, DiBenedetto.
Oh. This is not how I thought this was going to go.
I will take it. I thought you were setting me up, you two. I thought I was sitting here in a trap like that hawk. I appreciate that comment.
I might come up with something better, but word man for now.
Well, I'm hoping that you and I, Flip, can spend a lot more time together, and I can give you fodder for even more nicknames. I know Eddie feels the same way.
You know, very recently, I spent a day marsh hen hunting, red fishing and marsh hen hunting. And I thought, maybe if you get the time and want to make the effort to do a marsh hen hunt, we've got a lot of them. It's a lot of fun.
I'll be right there, Flip. I really appreciate the invite, buddy. Thanks for that. And that wraps up our episode.
I'll be there, Flip. I love a marsh hen.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, maybe the three of us can get together. To your point, Eddie, it would be a dream.
Yes, it would.
I love both you fellas. And Flip, it's so great to have you on. Thank you so much for your time. It's always, always a pleasure.
Flip, what a great conversation, man. I know we could have so many more. Maybe we will. I'd enjoy that. I think a lot of folks would enjoy that. But appreciate your time spent with us here today, buddy.
It's been my pleasure, guys, and hope our paths cross soon and often.
Wow. That wraps up the first episode of the Wild South podcast. Could not be more thankful to Flip for sharing his time and his stories with us. I mean, what a delight. Before we go, I got to tell you that T. Edward here is actually writing a book about Flip. That is, if he finishes that book. When's it coming out, Eddie?
Dave, friends don't ask friends about their book deadlines. You should know this. I am stoked about what we've done. Flip and I have been working on this for a couple of years now. And when it's all buttoned up, David DiBenedetto will be the first to know.
And I'll tell all of you as soon as I do. All right, the Wild South podcast comes to you from Garden & Gun Magazine. This episode was produced and edited by Christine Fennessy, with music by our longtime friends and terrific fishermen, Woody Platt and Bennett Sullivan. Check us out wherever you get your shows, and if you could take a second, do please leave us a review.
Oh yeah, don't forget, this is our first episode, first season, so we'll take all the love you can share.
From here in Charleston, South Carolina, I'm Dave DiBenedetto.
And in Raleigh, North Carolina, Eddie Nickens. We'll see you next time on The Wild South.